I'm Marcus Sterling, 47, and until 3 nights ago, I thought my biggest worry was managing my $50 million fortune. That was before my best friend of 25 years, David Chen, slipped something into my wine at what I thought was a celebration dinner for my latest business acquisition. The metallic taste hit me first, followed by the burning sensation in my throat. As I collapsed onto his marble floor, gasping for air, I heard him on the phone with my lawyer, asking about the specifics of my will. You see, David wasn't just my best friend, he was also my sole heir, a detail I'd shared with him years ago when we were both broke college students. But what David doesn't know is that I survived, and now I know exactly who he really is. If you've ever trusted someone with your life only to discover they'd rather have your death, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get very dark, very fast. To understand how deeply David's betrayal cut, you need to know how our friendship began. It was 1998, and we were both seniors at State University, living off ramen noodles and dreams. I was studying business with a minor in computer science, while David was pursuing accounting. We met in a statistics class that neither of us wanted to take, but both needed to graduate. I remember the exact moment our friendship solidified. It was during finals week, and I was cramming in the library, when David slumped into the chair across from me, looking absolutely defeated. His calculator had died. He was broke until his next financial aid check, and the stats exam was in 6 hours. Without hesitation, I slid my backup calculator across the table. Keep it, I told him. I've got another one. That small gesture meant everything to David. Later, he told me it was the first time someone had helped him without expecting anything in return. We spent that entire night studying together, sharing not just notes but our dreams. David wanted to be a CPA and help small businesses succeed. I wanted to build something from nothing, to prove that a kid from a working-class family could make it big. We both came from humble beginnings. My dad was a mechanic, my mom cleaned offices at night. David's parents ran a small corner grocery store that barely kept the family afloat. We understood each other's hunger for something better, something more stable than the paycheck-to-paycheck existence our families knew. After graduation, we made a pact. Standing in our cheap rental caps and gowns, holding that faded photo David's mom took of us, we promised to always have each other's backs. If one of us made it big, we'd pull the other up. If one of us fell, the other would be there to catch them. It seemed so simple then, so pure. David landed a job at a mid-sized accounting firm, while I started working for a tech startup during the day and flipping houses on weekends. With money borrowed from my dad's retirement fund, those early years were tough, but we supported each other. When David's first apartment flooded, he stayed on my couch for 3 months. When I needed someone to help me renovate a property, David spent every weekend covered in drywall dust, never asking for a dime. We celebrated each other's small victories. David's promotion to senior accountant, my first profitable house flip, his engagement to Sarah, my acceptance into a real estate investment group. Those were good years, honest years, when friendship meant something pure and But even then, there were subtle differences in our approaches to money and success. David was cautious, methodical, content with steady progress. I was willing to take bigger risks, to leverage everything, for the chance at something greater. He used to joke that I had golden gut instincts, while he preferred tried and true methods. Little did I know that as my instincts paid off and the gap between our financial situations widened, something was changing in David. The seeds of resentment were being planted, though they'd take years to grow into the poisonous tree that would nearly kill me. The first million came when I was 32. I'd been buying distressed properties, renovating them, and either flipping or renting them out for 8 years. But this deal was different, an entire apartment complex going into foreclosure. With potential I could see that others missed. The previous owner had let it deteriorate, but the bones were solid, and it sat in an area primed for gentrification. I leveraged everything I had and convinced 3 other investors to join me. We bought the complex for $800,000, spent another $400,000 on renovations, and sold it 18 months later for $2.1 million. My share of the profit was $600,000. But more importantly, it opened doors to bigger opportunities. David was genuinely happy for me then. I remember calling him the moment the check cleared, and he whooped so loud his colleagues at the accounting firm thought something was wrong. We celebrated that night at the fanciest restaurant in town. My treat, of course. David raised his glass and said, "To my brilliant friend who's going to own half the city someday, but success has a way of accelerating." That first big deal led to 3 more within 2 years. I started a real estate investment company, brought in partners with serious capital, and began acquiring commercial properties. Meanwhile, David's career had plateaued. He'd made partner at his firm, but the income ceiling was clear, and he watched my net worth grow exponentially while his increased incrementally. I tried to include David in my success. I hired his firm to handle the accounting for my properties. I offered him investment opportunities, even willing to front him the money to get started, but David always declined. "I'm not a risk taker like you, Marcus," he'd say. "I'll stick to what I know." What I didn't realize was that David's refusal came from pride, not prudence. He later told me he felt like accepting my help would make him dependent, would confirm that I was the successful one and he was just along for the ride. So instead, he watched from the sidelines as my empire grew. By age 38, my portfolio included 12 commercial properties, a construction company, and stakes in 4 tech startups. My net worth had reached $15 million. David, meanwhile, was making $120,000 a year at good money, but a fraction of what I was earning in a single deal. The breaking point should have been obvious to me, but I was too caught up in my own success to notice. David started making subtle comments about lucky breaks and connections, explaining my success. He'd joke about what it must be like to be born under a lucky star, or how some people just have all the Midas touch. The truth was, luck had little to do with it. I was working 16-hour days, studying market trends, networking constantly, and taking calculated risks that kept me awake at night. But David began to believe that my success was somehow unearned, that fate had simply chosen me over him. Still, I trusted him completely. When I updated my will at 35, making David my primary beneficiary, it felt natural. I had no family beyond distant relatives, and David was my brother in everything but blood. If something happened to me, who else would I trust with everything I'd built? I never imagined that decision would one day make me a target. Looking back, the warning signs were there for months before that fatal dinner. I just chose to ignore them, or worse, to rationalize them away because I couldn't accept that my closest friend was becoming someone. I didn't recognize that it started with small things. David began canceling our monthly golf games, claiming he was too busy with work. When we did meet for drinks, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone. His jokes became more barbed, his comments about my success more pointed. "Must be nice to have money solve all your problems," he'd say. "Or I wouldn't know what it's like to buy my way out of trouble." The first real red flag came when David asked me for a loan. $25,000, he said, for some home improvements Sarah wanted to make. It wasn't unusual for friends to help each other, and the amount was pocket change to me, so I transferred the money immediately. But something felt off about how he asked, nervous, evasive, not meeting my eyes. 3 months later, he asked for another loan, $50,000 this time, claiming his firm was going through a rough patch and he needed to cover some personal expenses until things stabilized. Again, I helped without question, though I did suggest that if his firm was struggling, maybe it was time to consider other opportunities. That's when David got defensive. "Not everyone can just jump from success to success like you, Marcus. Some of us have to work within the system." The bitterness in his voice surprised me, but I attributed it to stress about his financial situation. What I didn't know was that David had developed a serious gambling problem. It had started small, weekly poker games with friends, occasional trips to the casino with Sarah, but as my success highlighted his own perceived failures, David began chasing bigger wins, convinced that one lucky break would put him on equal footing with me. The poker games became daily online sessions. The casino visits became solo trips that lasted entire weekends. David was hemorrhaging money, not just the loans I'd given him, but his savings, their mortgage payments, even money from his firm's client accounts that he planned to replace after his next big win. Sarah tried to intervene, but David had become skilled at hiding the extent of his addiction. He had secret credit cards, hidden accounts, elaborate lies about where the money was going. When Sarah finally discovered the truth, they were already $200,000 in debt beyond what he'd borrowed from me. The desperate phone calls started coming at odd hours. David would ramble about investment opportunities, about surefire ways to make quick money. He pitched me on everything from cryptocurrency schemes to multi-level marketing programs. Each conversation revealed a man growing more desperate, more willing to believe in get-rich-quick fantasies. I should have recognized that desperation makes people dangerous. Instead, I felt sorry for my old friend and tried to help him see reason. I offered to pay for counseling, to help him restructure his debts, even to bring him into my business as a full partner if he could get clean. David's response was to withdraw further. He stopped returning my calls promptly, avoided social gatherings where we'd both be present, and when we did interact, there was a strange intensity in his eyes, part shame, part calculation, part something darker I couldn't identify. The final warning sign came just 2 weeks before the dinner. I was at a restaurant downtown when I saw David at a corner table with 2 men I didn't recognize. Something about the meeting looked tense, urgent. David was showing them papers, and one of the men kept tapping his watch aggressively. When David looked up and saw me, his face went white. He quickly folded the papers and said something that made both men turn to look at me. When I approached their table, the 2 men left. Immediately, David claimed they were potential clients, but he couldn't explain why they looked more like debt collectors than small business owners seeking accounting services. "You look worried, David," I told him. "Whatever's going on, you know you can talk to me." His response chills me now. "Sometimes talking isn't enough, Marcus. Sometimes the only solution is action." I thought he meant taking action to fix his problems. I had no idea he meant taking action against me. The text message came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports for my construction company. It was from David, and something about the tone immediately caught my attention. Hey Marcus, I know we haven't talked much lately, but I'd love to have you over for dinner Friday night. Just the two of us. Sarah's visiting her mother. I want to celebrate your latest acquisition properly this time. We never got to toast the Riverside project. The Riverside project was a $12 million commercial development I'd just closed on. Expanding my portfolio into mixed-use properties. David was right. We hadn't celebrated it together. In fact, we hadn't had a proper conversation in weeks. What struck me as odd was his insistence on hosting. In all our years of friendship, David had always preferred meeting at restaurants, or coming to my house. His apartment was nice but modest, and he'd always seemed slightly embarrassed by the contrast when I visited. Sarah usually handled their entertaining, but with her away, David was taking the unusual step of cooking dinner himself. That sounds great, I texted back. What can I bring? Just yourself and an appetite. I'm making that pasta dish you love, and I picked up a bottle of wine I think you'll appreciate. The enthusiasm in his message seemed forced, like he was trying too hard to sound casual, but I dismissed my unease as overthinking. Maybe David was finally ready to have an honest conversation about whatever had been bothering him lately. Maybe he'd decided to accept my offer to bring him into the business. Friday evening, I arrived at David's apartment building at 7 sharp. He buzzed me up immediately, and I could hear music playing from his unit as I climbed the stairs. When he opened the door, David looked more nervous than I'd seen him in years. He was wearing a dress shirt and tie, which was unusual for a casual dinner between friends. Marcus, right on time, he said, embracing me with what felt like forced enthusiasm. Come in, I've got everything ready. The apartment was immaculate, more so than I'd ever seen it. Candles were lit on the dining table, and the good china was set for two. A bottle of wine sat breathing on the counter, an expensive Bordeaux that must have cost more than David typically spent on a week's worth of groceries. This is quite a production, I said, genuinely touched by the effort. You didn't have to go to all this trouble? No trouble at all, David replied, but his hands were shaking slightly as he poured the wine. You've been such a good friend over the years, Marcus. I wanted to do something special. The past tense bothered me. Have been? I hope I still am. Of course. Poor choice of words. He handed me a glass, and I noticed he'd already poured his own and taken several sips. Here's to friendship and success. We clinked glasses, and I took a generous sip of the wine. It was excellent, rich, complex, with notes of dark fruit and oak, but underneath those flavors, there was something else. A slight metallic aftertaste that seemed out of place in such a quality bottle. This is incredible wine, I said, taking another sip to confirm what I was tasting. The metallic note was definitely there, subtle but persistent. I'm glad you like it, David said, watching me carefully. I wanted tonight to be memorable. Throughout dinner, David seemed to be monitoring my wine consumption. He kept refilling my glass, encouraging me to drink more. You're not driving, are you? I can call you a cab later. His concern for my transportation seemed premature, considering we'd barely finished the appetizer. The conversation felt stilted, like David was following a script. He asked about my business, my plans for expansion, my thoughts on the future, but his questions had an odd focus on my personal life, whether I was dating anyone seriously, if I had any plans to start a family, what my long-term goals were beyond building wealth. You know, he said as we finished the main course, you should really think about settling down, having someone to share all this success with. I'm not in any hurry, I replied, feeling slightly dizzy. The wine was hitting me harder than usual, which was strange since I'd only had 2 glasses and had eaten a full meal. But what if something happened to you? David pressed. I mean, you work so hard, take so many risks. What would happen to everything you've built? The question felt loaded, and I studied his face carefully. There was something in his expression, anticipation, maybe, or calculation. That's what wills are for, I said slowly, right? Of course. And you updated yours recently, didn't you? After the Riverside deal. I hadn't updated my will after Riverside, but David seemed to think I had. More concerning was why he was asking it all. Why the sudden interest in my estate planning? Just curious. You know how I worry about you. But David's smile didn't reach his eyes, and I noticed his hands were trembling again. That's when the room began to spin, and I realized something was very, very wrong. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The metallic taste, the unusual drowsiness, David's nervous behavior. I was being poisoned. My best friend of 25 years was trying to kill me. David, I said, my voice already starting to slur. What did you put in the wine? His face went white, but he tried to maintain his innocent facade. What are you talking about? You're not making sense. But I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. My vision was beginning to blur, and I felt my muscles becoming weak and unresponsive. Whatever he'd used was fast acting. How could you? I whispered, gripping the edge of the table as I tried to stand. My legs buckled, and I collapsed back into the chair. David had stopped pretending. I'm sorry, Marcus, I really am, but I didn't have a choice. His voice was shaking now, tears starting to form in his eyes. They're going to kill Sarah if I don't pay them back. They're going to kill both of us. Who? I managed to ask, though speaking was becoming increasingly difficult. The people I owe money to. $200,000, Marcus, in gambling debts. And that's just the start of it. David was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. I took money from client accounts. If that comes out, I'll go to prison. Sarah will lose everything. My head was spinning, and I could barely keep my eyes open. But I forced myself to stay conscious, to understand what was happening. You could have asked me for help. I would have asked you for more money. David's voice cracked. Always the generous friend, always the successful one. Do you know what it's like living in your shadow, Marcus? Do you know what it's like watching everything come so easily to you? While I struggle with every decision, I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My body was shutting down, and I slumped forward, my head hitting the table. From this position, I could see David's feet as he paced around the room. I never wanted it to come to this, he was saying, his voice sounding distant. But you made me your heir. You told me years ago that if anything happened to you, everything would come to me. I wouldn't have to worry about money ever again. Through my blurred vision, I saw him pick up his phone and dial a number. It's done, he said to whoever answered. Yes, I'm sure. No, there's no going back now. A different voice came on the line, and I strained to hear the conversation. How long? David asked. Are you certain? Okay, I'll call you in the morning, with the details. He hung up and knelt down beside my chair. Marcus, can you hear me? I need you to know that I really did love you like a brother. This isn't personal, it's just necessary. I wanted to tell him that it was the most personal thing imaginable, that friendship meant something more than financial convenience, but I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. David lifted my wrist, checking for a pulse. I forced myself to slow my breathing, to make it as shallow as possible. If I was going to survive this, I needed him to believe I was dead or close to it. Asterisk. Come on, Marcus, he whispered. Just let go. It'll be easier if you just let go. But I wasn't ready to let go. I was angry, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. This man who I'd trusted with everything, who I'd helped repeatedly, who I'd made my heir out of love and loyalty, was murdering me for money. After what felt like hours, David made another phone call. I think it's over, he said quietly. His breathing is very shallow. Should I call 911 now? The voice on the other end must have told him to wait, because David sat down on his couch and just watched me. Every few minutes he'd check my pulse, put his ear near my mouth to listen for breathing. As the hours passed, I heard David making a series of calls. To his lawyer, asking about the timeline for processing a will. To my lawyer, expressing concern that he hadn't heard from me in a few days. To the funeral home, inquiring about for a friend who'd been talking about mortality lately. The scope of his planning was chilling. This wasn't a moment of desperation, it was a calculated murder, thought out in advance. David had researched exactly how to kill me and how to cover it up afterward. As dawn broke through the apartment windows, David finally called 911. I need to report a death, he said, his voice perfectly calibrated to sound shocked and grieved. My best friend came over for dinner last night, and I found him collapsed this morning. I think he had a heart attack. When the paramedics arrived, I remained completely still as they checked my vital signs. One of them found a faint pulse, and I was rushed to the hospital. David rode in the ambulance, holding my hand and telling the paramedics about my history of heart problems. A complete fabrication. At the hospital, David played the role of the devastated best friend perfectly. He called my distant relatives, spoke to doctors about my condition, and even started making arrangements for what he assumed would be my inevitable death. But I had survived the initial poisoning, and now I was conscious enough to understand exactly what David had done and why. As I lay in that hospital bed, barely alive but aware, I began planning my revenge. The doctors told David I was in a coma with minimal brain activity. What they didn't know was that I could hear everything happening around me. The poison had left me paralyzed and unable to speak, but my mind was sharp, processing every conversation, every visitor, every plan David made for my death. For 3 days I've remained in this conscious but unresponsive state. David was at my bedside constantly, playing the grieving best friend for the medical staff, while using our private moments to update me on his progress with my estate. The lawyers say it could take a few weeks to process everything, he whispered to my supposedly unconscious form. But don't worry, Marcus. I'll make sure your money goes to good use. Sarah and I have been looking at houses in the suburbs. Something with a nice yard, maybe a pool. The casual way he discussed spending my money while I lay dying was nauseating, but what truly shocked me was discovering that David had been planning this for months. He'd researched the specific poison he used, practiced his grieving friend routine, and even prepared forged documents to speed up the inheritance process. On the second day, he brought a briefcase to the hospital and spread papers across the visitor's chair. I've been thinking about your business interests, he said conversationally, as if I were an active participant in the discussion. The construction company could be sold quickly. The The real estate portfolio might take longer, but I've already contacted a few brokers. David had done his homework. He knew the value of every asset I owned, had researched the tax implications of inheritance, and identified which properties could be liquidated fastest. This wasn't grief-driven financial planning, it was the calculated dismantling of everything I'd built. The most disturbing moment came when David's phone rang, and I recognized the voice of the man he'd been meeting with at the restaurant. How much longer? The voice demanded. Our patience isn't infinite. He's not going to recover, David assured him. The doctors are talking about pulling life support. Once that happens, the death certificate gets issued, and I can access the accounts. You better be right about this will situation. If you've miscalculated ... I haven't miscalculated. Marcus trusted me completely. I'm his only heir, and I have all the documentation to prove it. After he hung up, David sat back down beside my bed. I know you can't hear me, he said, but I want you to know that I really am sorry. You were a good friend, Marcus. You deserved better than this. The irony was staggering. He was apologizing for murdering me while simultaneously planning to steal my fortune. In David's twisted logic, he was the victim here, forced into this terrible situation by circumstances beyond his control. On the third night, David made a call that changed everything. Tomorrow morning, he told someone, the doctors are meeting with me about ending life support. Once that's done, we can move forward with the inheritance. That's when I realized I had to act. If I waited much longer, David's plan would succeed completely. The medical staff already thought I was brain dead, and my supposed best friend was advocating for pulling the plug. I spent that entire night forcing my body to respond, fighting against whatever David had given me. By dawn, I could move my fingers slightly, and by mid-morning I managed to open my eyes when no one was looking. The nurse who discovered I was conscious nearly fainted. Doctor, she shouted. He's awake. Mr. Sterling is awake. David was in the cafeteria when it happened, and by the time he returned to my room, I was sitting up and drinking water. The look on his face was priceless, terror mixed with disbelief, like he was seeing a ghost. Marcus, he exclaimed, rushing to my bedside with practiced concern. Thank God you're okay. I was so worried, but I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he reached for me. David had been counting on my death, had already spent my money in his mind, had promised other people that he'd soon be wealthy. What happened to me? I asked weakly, playing along with his charade, while I gathered my strength. The doctors think you had some kind of allergic reaction, David said quickly. Possibly to something you ate at dinner. They said it was touch and go for a while. An allergic reaction. Of course that would be his story. It explained the symptoms while making it seem accidental rather than intentional. I feel terrible about it, David continued. If I'd known you were allergic to something I cooked. It's not your fault, I assured him, watching his relief at my apparent acceptance of his lie. These things happen. But inside, I was planning. David thought he'd gotten away with attempted murder. He had no idea that I'd heard every word, seen every document, understood the full scope of his betrayal. Now it was my turn to plan in secret. Once I was released from the hospital, I launched my own private investigation into David's betrayal. I had to be careful. He was watching me closely, probably worried that I might remember something from that night, or notice inconsistencies in his story. I started with my security system. My house had cameras everywhere, and while David didn't know it, so did my car. The footage from the night of the dinner showed me arriving at David's building looking healthy and alert, then leaving in an ambulance hours later, barely alive. More importantly, I discovered that David had been watching my house for weeks before the poisoning. The cameras caught him driving by at odd hours, sometimes parking across the street and just sitting in his car, studying my property. This wasn't a spur-of-a-moment decision, it was surveillance. I hired a private investigator without telling anyone, including my lawyer. James Morrison was a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes and domestic investigations. When I showed him the evidence I'd gathered, his first question was whether I'd considered going to the police. Not yet, I told him. I need to understand the full scope of what David's done before I decide how to handle this. Morrison's investigation revealed the extent of David's financial desperation. The gambling debts were even worse than I'd overheard. He owed money to 3 different loan sharks, had maxed out a dozen credit cards, and had embezzled nearly $100,000 from his accounting firm's client accounts. Your friend is in serious trouble, Morrison reported during our second meeting. The people he owes money to aren't the type to negotiate payment plans. They've been pressuring him for months. And according to my sources, they've made threats against his wife. That explained David's desperation, but it didn't excuse attempted murder. Morrison also discovered that David had been researching my business interests extensively, downloading financial reports, studying property records, even contacting some of my business partners under false pretenses. He's been planning to inherit your wealth for at least 6 months, Morrison concluded. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated attempted murder with financial gain as the motive. The most damning evidence came from David's own computer. Morrison had contacts who could retrieve deleted files, and what they found was chilling. David had researched various poisons, their detection rates, and their symptoms. He'd studied inheritance laws, tax implications, and probate procedures. Most shocking of all, we found a detailed timeline David had created for liquidating my assets after my death. He'd identified which properties to sell first, which business partnerships to dissolve, and how to minimize tax liability while maximizing cash flow. He'd even researched expensive homes in exclusive neighborhoods, planning how to spend money. That wasn't yet his asterisk, but David had made one crucial mistake in his research. The poison he'd used a rare plant extract that was difficult to detect in standard toxicology screens left traces in hair follicles for months. Morrison arranged for a private lab to test samples of my hair, and the results confirmed what we both suspected. This is enough evidence to put him away for attempted murder, Morrison said. The question is how you want to proceed. I had been thinking about that constantly. Part of me wanted to see David arrested immediately, to watch him face the consequences of his betrayal, but another part of me wanted to understand how deep his deception went. How many people might be involved, and whether he'd try to finish what he started. I want to give him enough rope to hang himself, I decided. Let him think his plan is still working while we gather more evidence. Morrison looked concerned. That's dangerous. If he realizes you're onto him, he won't. David thinks he's the smartest person in the room, that he's pulled off the perfect crime. His arrogance will be his downfall. We developed a strategy. I would continue acting like the grateful friend who'd narrowly survived a medical emergency. Meanwhile, Morrison would document David's continued efforts to position himself for inheritance, building an airtight case for attempted murder and conspiracy. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed between us. When David called to check on my recovery, I had to sound genuinely appreciative. When he suggested we meet for lunch to celebrate my second chance at life, I had to accept with enthusiasm. During that lunch, David casually mentioned that my health scare had made him think about mortality and planning for the future. You should really consider updating your will, he suggested. Maybe add some contingencies in case something like this happens again. The audacity was breathtaking. David was literally advising me on how to make it easier for him to inherit my wealth after he killed me, but I played along, agreeing that my recent experience had made me think more seriously about estate planning. Actually, I said, I'm meeting with my lawyer next week to review everything. Make sure all my affairs are in order. David's eyes lit up with interest. That's smart. You know, if you ever want a second opinion on the financial aspects, I'd be happy to take a look. No charge, of course. That's what friends are for. Friends. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, but I managed to smile and thank him for his generosity. All the while, I was recording our conversation and planning his downfall. David's performance as the concerned best friend extended far beyond our private interactions. He'd already begun crafting a narrative about my near-death experience that positioned him as the devoted friend who'd stayed by my side. Throughout the crisis. At the country club, where we both had memberships, David held court at the bar, regaling anyone who would listen with the story of my allergic reaction and his heroic efforts to save my life. I knew something was wrong the moment he collapsed. He'd say, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. I immediately called 911 and rode with him to the hospital. Thank God I was there. The sympathy he received was genuine, which made his deception even more nauseating. People praised him for being such a loyal friend, for staying at the hospital during my coma, for handling my business affairs while I recovered. David basked in this attention, probably seeing it as practice for the grieving heir role he'd planned to play after my death. Sarah, David's wife, seemed genuinely concerned about my health when she called to check on my recovery. David was so worried about you, she said. He barely slept while you were in the hospital. He kept saying he should have known you were having a reaction to something. The irony was devastating. Sarah had no idea that her husband had poisoned me, that his sleepless nights were caused by anxiety about whether I'd survive, not concern for my well-being. She was living with a would-be murderer and thanking him for his compassion. My distant relatives, a few cousins I saw maybe twice a year, also reached out after hearing about my hospitalization. David had contacted them personally, explaining my condition and offering to serve as a liaison for updates. He'd positioned himself as my closest family, the person others should contact if they had concerns about my health or welfare. Your friend David seems really devoted, my cousin Jennifer told me during a phone call. He called me twice a day, while you were unconscious, just to keep the family updated. You're lucky to have someone who cares about you that much. Lucky if she only knew how lucky I was to have survived. David's caring attention. The most disturbing aspect of David's performance was how he used my near-death experience to strengthen his position as my heir. During conversations with mutual friends, he'd work in comments about how my health scare had made us both think about what really matters, and taking care of the people you love. Marcus and I have been friends for 25 years, he told our golf foursome. We've always said we're closer than brothers. If something had happened to him, I don't know how I would have coped with the loss. These weren't just empty words. David was laying groundwork for his eventual inheritance. Claimed, if anyone questioned why a friend would inherit such a large estate, David was establishing a narrative of our unusually close relationship and his devastation at my near loss. He even started making subtle inquiries about my business operations, claiming concern about my ability to handle stress after my medical emergency. Marcus works too hard, he told my construction company foreman. This health scare should be a wake-up call about slowing down, maybe bringing in partners to share the load. The foreman later told me about this conversation, mentioning how thoughtful it was for David to be concerned about my well-being. Had no idea that David was actually evaluating which aspects of my business empire would be easiest to liquidate after murdering me. David also began positioning himself with my lawyer and accountant as someone with intimate knowledge of my affairs. He'd call my lawyer's office, ostensibly to check on my recovery, but always managing to work in questions about estate planning and inheritance procedures. David Chen called again, my lawyer's secretary mentioned during one of my visits. He seems very concerned about making sure all your legal affairs are in order after your health scare. He asked if there was anything he could do to help manage your business interests while you recover. Even my household staff noticed David's increased presence. He'd started coming by my house regularly, claiming he wanted to check on my recovery, but actually conducting what amounted to surveillance. My housekeeper mentioned that he'd asked detailed questions about my daily routine, my eating habits, and whether I'd made any changes to my lifestyle after my hospital stay. Mr. Chen seems very worried about you, she told me. He asked if you've been taking any new medications or if your diet has changed since you got sick. David was evaluating whether his first murder attempt had left me suspicious or had changed my habits in ways that might complicate a second attempt. The calculating nature of his concern was chilling. Most people saw David's behavior as the actions of a devoted friend going above and beyond for someone he cared about. They couldn't imagine that this same person had poisoned me and was actively planning how to finish the job if necessary. But I saw it for what it really was, a predator maintaining his cover while positioning himself for another attack. 3 weeks after my poisoning, I told David I'd decided to update my will. His reaction was immediate and intense, a flash of excitement quickly masked by appropriate concern for my mortality. That's probably wise, he said carefully. Your recent health scare really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Exactly. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't survived. All my assets would have been tied up in probate for months while lawyers sorted everything out. David leaned forward, unable to hide his interest. What kind of changes are you considering? Nothing dramatic, just some streamlining to make the inheritance process smoother. Maybe adding some liquid assets to ensure immediate access to funds for whoever inherits. I watched David's pupils dilate with greed. The idea of immediate access to cash clearly appealed to him, probably because his creditors weren't patient people. That makes sense, he said. You know, if you want someone to review the changes before you finalize them, I'd be happy to take a look, just to make sure everything is structured efficiently from a tax perspective. Of course he would. David wanted to see exactly what he'd be inheriting and how quickly he could access it after my death. I met with my lawyer, Robert Hutchinson, the following day. Robert had been handling my legal affairs for 8 years, and I trusted him completely. When I explained the situation, his first instinct was to contact the police immediately. Marcus, this is attempted murder. We have evidence. Why are we playing games instead of having him arrested? Because I want to understand the full scope of his planning, and I want him to reveal anyone else who might be involved. I paused, considering my words carefully, but mostly, I want him to experience the same betrayal he tried to inflict on me. Robert looked uncomfortable with my approach, but he agreed to help. We crafted a revised will that appeared to benefit David even more than the original, while actually containing provisions that would nullify his inheritance if he were ever convicted of a crime against me. The new will also included a trust structure that would delay access to the bulk of my assets for 6 months after my death, ostensibly for tax purposes, but actually to give authorities time to investigate if my death seems suspicious. David won't be able to resist trying to expedite this process, I told Robert. His debts are immediate, and the people he owes money to won't wait 6 months for payment. We scheduled the will signing for the following Friday, and I invited David to witness the document. His presence would serve 2 purposes. It would make him feel included in the process, and it would give us an opportunity to observe his reaction to the terms. When David arrived at Robert's office, he was dressed more formally than usual and carrying a leather portfolio. I brought some notes, he explained, just some thoughts about estate planning structures that might be beneficial. Robert and I exchanged glances. David had prepared for this meeting like a business presentation, complete with research and recommendations. The audacity was stunning. He was advising me on how to structure the inheritance he planned to claim after murdering me. During the meeting, David made several suggestions that would have accelerated his access to my assets. He recommended converting more investments to liquid funds, establishing lines of credit against my properties, and creating emergency access provisions for the executor of the estate. These changes would ensure that if something unexpected happened, David said, the estate could meet immediate obligations without having to wait for property sales or investment liquidations. Robert nodded politely while taking notes, but I could see his disgust at David's transparent maneuvering. We were watching a man plan his own payday from my death. The most revealing moment came when Robert explained the 6-month delay provision in the trust structure. David's face went white, and his hands clenched the arms of his chair. 6 months seems like a long time, he said, trying to sound casual. Are you sure that's necessary? What if the beneficiary had immediate financial needs? The delay protects against hasty decisions during grief, Robert explained smoothly. It also ensures proper tax planning and prevents challenges to the estate. David nodded, but I could see him calculating whether he could survive 6 months with his current creditors. The answer was clearly no, which meant he'd have to find ways to access funds sooner, probably through loans against his expected inheritance. After signing the will, David seemed agitated and distracted. He declined my invitation to lunch, claiming he had urgent business to attend to. As soon as he left Robert's office, I knew he'd be making phone calls to his creditors, trying to buy more time or negotiate payment terms. He's going to accelerate his timeline, Robert observed. If he needs immediate access to your assets, he can't wait for natural causes to take their course. That evening, my private investigator called with an update. David had been seen meeting with the same 2 men from the restaurant, and the conversation had appeared heated. Phone records showed he'd made several calls to loan sharks, apparently trying to renegotiate his payment schedule. He's running out of time, Morrison reported. My sources say his creditors are losing patience. They've given him until the end of the month to come up with a substantial payment. The end of the month was 2 weeks away. If David was going to try to kill me again, it would have to be soon. I was ready for him. The trap was set for Monday morning. I'd told David that Robert wanted to meet with both of us to finalize some administrative details about the will. What David didn't know was that the conference room would also contain Detective Sarah Martinez from the police department, my private investigator Morrison, and a collection of evidence that would destroy his life. David arrived at Robert's office, precisely on time, carrying the same leather portfolio and wearing his most trustworthy smile. Good morning, Marcus. You look like you're feeling much better. I am, thanks to friends like you who stood by me during the crisis. The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but David beamed at the compliment. Robert led us into the conference room where David's expression immediately shifted from confidence to confusion. The table was covered with documents, photographs, and a laptop displaying security footage. What's all this? David asked, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. The truth, I said simply, about what really happened at your dinner party. Detective Martinez stepped forward and introduced herself. David's face went ashen when he realized law enforcement was involved, but he tried to maintain his innocent facade. I don't understand, he said, looking between us frantically. What's going on here? Morrison opened his laptop and began playing the security footage from my car's dashboard camera. The timestamp showed the night of the dinner, and the video clearly captured my deteriorating condition as David drove me home afterward. A drive I didn't remember but that David had never mentioned. You told everyone you called 911 from your apartment, Detective Martinez said, but this footage shows you drove Marcus home first, presumably to stage the scene to look like he'd collapsed at his own house. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He asked me to drive him home. He said he felt sick but thought it would pass. Interesting, Morrison interjected. Because the toxicology report shows he had been poisoned with aconitine, a plant extract that causes rapid paralysis. He wouldn't have been capable of making coherent requests. Robert slid a thick folder across the table. We also have David's internet search history, which shows extensive research into various poisons, their symptoms, and their detection rates. The searches began 4 months ago. David stared at the folder as if it contained a venomous snake. This is some kind of mistake. I would never hurt Marcus. He's my best friend. Your best friend who you tried to murder for his money, Detective Martinez said flatly. We have evidence of your gambling debts, your embezzlement from client accounts, and your meetings with loan sharks who threatened your family. I'd remained silent during this exchange, watching David's carefully constructed world crumble around him. Now I leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was calm but deadly serious. I heard everything, David. While you thought I was dying, I was conscious. I heard you tell your creditors that it was done. I heard you planning how to spend my money. I heard you call the funeral home. David's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand the pressure I was under. They were going to kill Sarah if I didn't pay them back. They showed me pictures of what they do to people who don't pay their debts. So you decided to murder your best friend instead of asking for help. The disbelief in my voice was genuine. I would have given you the money, David. I would have paid off every debt, covered every obligation, and helped you start over. And then what? David's voice cracked with emotion. I would have owed you everything. I would have been dependent on your charity for the rest of my life. At least this way, I would have been free. The twisted logic was stunning. In David's mind, inheriting my wealth through murder was preferable to accepting help from a friend because it preserved his pride. Detective Martinez placed a pair of handcuffs on the table. David Chen, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, David turned to me with tears streaming down his face. "Marcus, please, think about Sarah. Think about what this will do to her." "I am thinking about Sarah," I replied. "She deserves to know who she's married to. She deserves the chance to build a life with someone who won't murder people to solve his problems." Robert handed Detective Martinez another folder. This contains documentation of David's attempts to forge revised versions of Marcus's will, giving himself even greater access to the estate. David hadn't just been planning to kill me, he'd been working to maximize his inheritance through fraudulent documents. The betrayal had layers I was still discovering. As Detective Martinez led David away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time. "I really did love you like a brother, Marcus. I hope someday you can understand that this wasn't about you. It was about survival." "No, David," I said quietly. "It was about greed. Brothers don't poison each other for money." After he was gone, the room fell silent except for the sound of Robert organizing the evidence files. Morrison closed his laptop and shook his head in amazement. "I've seen a lot of betrayals in my career," he said, "but I've never seen anything quite like this. 25 years of friendship, and he threw it all away for money." Detective Martinez returned a few minutes later. "He's being booked now. The district attorney will want to meet with you tomorrow to discuss the charges and your testimony." As I left Robert's office that morning, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something approaching closure. David was in custody. The immediate threat to my life was over, and justice was finally beginning. But I also felt the profound loss of a friendship I'd treasured for most of my adult life. The David I'd known and loved was gone, replaced by a desperate stranger who had been willing to kill for money. The hardest part was accepting that maybe I'd never really known him at all. 3 days after David's arrest, I received an unexpected phone call from the county jail. David was requesting a visit, claiming he had important information about his case that he would only share with me. Against the advice of both Robert and Detective Martinez, I agreed to see him. The visiting room at the county jail was a sterile, depressing place, with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs bolted to the floor. When David was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, he looked like he'd aged 10 years and 3 days. His eyes were hollow, his hands shook, and he'd clearly been crying. "Marcus," he said as he sat down across from me, separated by a thick glass partition. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I almost didn't. I picked up the phone, studying the man who'd once been my closest friend. "What could you possibly have to say to me now?" David took a shuddering breath before speaking. "I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. Everything got so out of control, and I didn't know how to stop it. You could have stopped it by not poisoning me in the first place." "You're right. You're absolutely right." David wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "But I need you to know the whole truth about why I did it. It wasn't just about the money." I waited, saying nothing. David had requested this meeting. He could carry the conversation. 6 months ago, these men approached me at the casino. They said they knew about my debts, about the money I'd taken from client accounts. They offered to cover everything, to make it all go away, but they wanted something in return. "What kind of something?" "Information about you. Your business, dealings, your assets, your personal habits." They said they were considering some kind of investment opportunity with you, but they needed inside information to evaluate the risk. I felt a chill run down my spine. "You were gathering intelligence on me for someone else." At first, that's all it was. Just answering questions about your routines, your properties, your financial situation. They paid me well for the information, and it seemed harmless. "You're a public figure in the business community anyway." David's voice was getting stronger as he told his story, as if unburdening himself of this secret was giving him energy. But then they started asking different questions. About your security systems, your staff, your schedule. About who would inherit if something happened to you. That's when I realized they weren't potential investors, they were planning something. And instead of warning me, you decided to beat them to it. They told me that if I didn't cooperate, they'd expose the embezzlement and the gambling debts. I'd go to prison, and Sarah would lose everything. But if I helped them, they'd make sure I came out ahead. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it through the slot beneath the glass partition. "This is a copy of their original plan. They were going to stage a home invasion, make it look like a robbery gone wrong. I was supposed to provide inside information to make it possible." I unfolded the paper and read what amounted to a detailed assassination plan. It included blueprints of my house, my daily schedule, information about my security system, and even details about my household staff's routines. When I realized what they were really planning, David continued, I panicked. I couldn't let them murder you, but I also couldn't expose them without destroying my own life. So I convinced them to let me handle it differently. You convinced them to let you murder me instead. I told them I could make it look like natural causes, that it would be cleaner and less risky than a home invasion. I said I could ensure they got their money without the complications of a criminal investigation. The piece of paper in my hands felt like it was burning. How much money are we talking about, David? They said they were owed $12 million by one of your business partners? Something about a deal that went bad, contracts that were breached. They figured if they couldn't collect from him, they'd collect from you. This was bigger than I'd imagined. David hadn't just been planning to murder me for inheritance money. He'd been planning to murder me to pay off someone else's debt to organized criminals. Who was the business partner? I don't know. They never told me. But Marcus, there's something else you need to know. David leaned closer to the glass, his voice dropping to a whisper. They're not done. My arrest doesn't change their plans. It just means they'll have to handle things differently. Are you threatening me? No. I'm trying to warn you. When I was arrested, they lost their inside source and their preferred method. But they haven't given up on collecting what they think they're owed. They're going to try again, probably sooner rather than later. I studied David's face, trying to determine if this was another manipulation or genuine concern for my safety. The fear in his eyes seemed real, but then again, he'd been an excellent actor throughout our friendship. Why should I believe anything you tell me now? Because I'm already going to prison for attempted murder. I have nothing left to lose by telling you the truth, and maybe if I help keep you alive, it will count for something when I face judgment. David's voice broke on the word judgment, and I realized he wasn't just talking about the legal system. He was talking about divine judgment, moral judgment, the judgment of history and his own conscience. There's something else, he continued, a confession I wrote in my cell. Everything I just told you, plus details about how they recruited me, how they planned the original assassination, everything I know about their operation. He slid another piece of paper through the slot. Give this to Detective Martinez. It might help her identify these people and protect you from whatever they're planning next. I took the confession but didn't read it immediately. David, why didn't you just tell me about this from the beginning? We could have handled it together. Because I was ashamed. Because I was weak. Because I'd gotten so deep into gambling and debt that I couldn't see any way out except through more deception. David's voice was barely audible now. I know you can never forgive me for what I tried to do. I can't forgive myself. But please, Marcus, be careful. These people are professionals, and they won't make the same mistakes I made. As I left the jail that day, I realized that David's betrayal was even worse than I'd thought. He hadn't just tried to murder me for money, he'd turned me into a target for organized criminals, who had no personal connection to me but saw my wealth as compensation for someone else's debt. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. Detective Martinez read David's confession with growing alarm, occasionally looking up at me with expressions that ranged from concern to disbelief. When she finished, she set the papers down and reached for her phone. We need to get you into protective custody immediately, she said. This changes everything about your case. What exactly are we dealing with here? Based on this confession, and some cross-referencing with ongoing investigations, it looks like you've been targeted by the Kozlov organization. They're a Russian crime syndicate that specializes in debt collection, money laundering, and unfortunately, contract killings. The name meant nothing to me, but Detective Martinez's expression made it clear this was serious. How would I have gotten on their radar? That's what we need to figure out. David mentions a business partner who owes them $12 million. Do you have any recent deals or partnerships that might connect you to someone with those kinds of debts? I spent the next hour going through my business relationships, trying to identify anyone who might have connections to organized crime. Most of my partners were established business people with solid reputations, but there were always risks in real estate and construction. Wait, I said suddenly. The Riverside project. My main partner on that deal was Viktor Petrov. He's been in the country for about 5 years. Said he made his money in import-export in Eastern Europe. Detective Martinez made a note. Tell me about your relationship with Petrov. We met through a mutual contact at a real estate investment conference. Viktor had cash and was looking for legitimate investment opportunities in the U.S., the Riverside deal was our first project together, but we've been discussing several other partnerships. How much money did Petrov invest in Riverside? $15 million. He put up 60% of the capital in exchange for 40% of the profits. It was a good deal for both of us. Detective Martinez was typing rapidly on her computer. Marcus, I need you to think carefully. Has Petrov asked you to do anything unusual? Any requests for favors? Introductions to other business people? Access to your financial institutions? As I considered her question, several seemingly innocent interactions with Viktor took on a more sinister tone. He'd been unusually interested in my other business relationships, my banking arrangements, and my personal security practices. He did ask me to introduce him to some of my other partners, I admitted. Said he was looking to diversify his investments. And he seemed very curious about my construction company's client list. Asterisk, did you make those introductions? Asterisk, a few? Viktor seemed legitimate, and his money was real. I didn't see any harm in helping him network. Asterisk, Detective Martinez's expression grew more troubled. Marcus, it's possible that Viktor Petrov is actually Viktor Kozlov, and you've been unknowingly helping a crime boss infiltrate the legitimate business community. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Viktor was connected to the people who'd recruited David, then I hadn't just been targeted by random criminals, I'd been betrayed by another business partner. We need to look at this from a different angle, Detective Martinez continued. If the Kozlov organization invested $15 million in your project, and they're claiming someone owes them $12 million, it's possible they're trying to recover money they believe was stolen from them, but the Riverside project was profitable. Victor got his investment back plus a significant return. That's what we need to verify. I'm going to need all your financial records for the Riverside deal, including bank transfers, profit distributions, and any communication with Petrov about the project. As we dug deeper into the Riverside transaction, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Victor's initial investment had come from a series of shell companies, based in offshore jurisdictions, known for money laundering. The money itself might have been clean by the time it reached our project, but its origins were questionable. More troubling was the discovery that Victor had been asking detailed questions about my personal finances throughout our partnership. He'd requested information about my other assets, my estate planning, and even my family relationships, information that had no relevance to our business deal. He was profiling you, Detective Martinez concluded, learning everything he could about your wealth, your security, and your vulnerabilities. The timeline was chilling. Victor had approached me about the Riverside partnership 8 months ago, around the same time that David's gambling debts had begun spiraling out of control. It wasn't a coincidence that both men had entered my life as potential threats during the same period. I think they've been planning this for almost a year, I told Detective Martinez. Victor gets close to me through legitimate business. David provides inside information about my personal life, and together they set up the perfect opportunity for theft or murder. But something went wrong with their plan, she observed. David's confession suggests there was disagreement about methodology. Maybe Victor wanted the home invasion approach, while David preferred something that looked natural. David said he convinced them to let him handle it his way, right? But now that David's in custody and his method failed, they're probably going back to Plan A. Detective Martinez arranged for increased security at my house and office, but she also recommended that I consider relocating temporarily until they could investigate the Kozlov organization and assess the ongoing threat. These people don't give up easily, she warned. If they believe you owe them money or that you've interfered with their operations, they'll keep coming until they get satisfaction. As I drove home that evening with a police escort, I realized that David's betrayal had been even more complex than I'd imagined. He hadn't just been a desperate friend trying to solve his financial problems. He'd been a recruited asset in a larger criminal conspiracy. The question now was whether Viktor Petrov would try to finish what David had started, or if he'd find some other way to collect what he believed he was owed. Either way, I wasn't planning to make it easy for him. The courthouse was packed with reporters when David's arraignment began. Word had leaked about the attempted murder case involving a wealthy businessman and his best friend, and the media was having a field day with the story of greed and betrayal. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had decided to pursue the maximum charges against David: attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and embezzlement. If convicted on all counts, he could face life in prison without parole. David's lawyer, a public defender named Michael Torres, had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA's office wasn't interested in anything less than a sentence. The evidence was too strong, the crime too calculated, and the public interest too high for them to show mercy. I sat in the front row of the gallery, watching as my former best friend was led into the courtroom in shackles. Sarah was there too, sitting on the opposite side of the aisle, her face streaked with tears. She'd filed for divorce the day after David's arrest, but she still came to every hearing. When the judge asked David how he pleaded to the charges, his voice was barely audible. "Guilty, Your Honor. Guilty to all charges." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. David's lawyer looked surprised. Apparently his client had decided to plead guilty without consulting him first. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison said sternly, "do you understand that by pleading guilty to attempted first-degree murder, you could be sentenced to life in prison?" "I understand, Your Honor. I also understand that I deserve whatever punishment you decide to impose." David turned to look at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and resignation. "I'm sorry, Marcus," he said loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "I'm sorry for everything." Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and pre-sentence investigations. As David was led away, Sarah approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. "Marcus, I need you to know that I had no idea," she said, her voice breaking. "If I had known what he was planning, I would have stopped him. I would have called you, called the police, something." "I know, Sarah. David's choices weren't your fault. He's destroyed everything," she continued. "Our marriage, our future, his career, and for what? Money he never would have been able to enjoy from prison." The investigation into Viktor Petrov and the Kozlov organization was moving more slowly than Detective Martinez had hoped. Viktor had disappeared shortly after David's arrest, and the shell companies he'd used to invest in the Riverside project had been dissolved. "He's probably back in Russia by now," Detective Martinez told me. "During one of our security briefings, but we're working with federal agencies to track his movements and identify other members of his organization. The FBI had become involved once they realized the case involved international organized crime. Agent Rebecca Foster was leading their investigation, and she'd discovered that Viktor Petrov was indeed connected to the Kozlov crime family. Your instincts were right, Agent Foster told me. Viktor Kozlov used the identity Viktor Petrov to infiltrate legitimate business circles in several major cities. The Riverside Project wasn't his first investment. He's been laundering money through real estate deals across the country, but why target me specifically for assassination? We think David Chen was originally recruited just to provide information about your operations, but when Kozlov realized how wealthy you were, he saw an opportunity to collect more than just intelligence. The federal investigation revealed that the Kozlov organization had been using business partnerships to identify wealthy targets for extortion, theft, and occasionally murder. I was just one of several business people who'd been marked for exploitation. The good news, Agent Foster continued, is that your survival and David's confession have given us unprecedented insight into their operations. We're using that information to protect other potential targets and build cases against the organization. As David's sentencing date approached, I struggled with whether to give a victim impact statement. Part of me wanted to confront him publicly about the depth of his betrayal, but another part of me just wanted the whole ordeal to be over. Sarah called me the night before the sentencing hearing. Marcus, I know this is asking a lot, but would you consider asking for leniency? David's cooperation with the federal investigation has been valuable, and he's genuinely remorseful. Sarah, he tried to murder me for money. He was working with organized criminals. How can you ask me to show mercy? Because the David I married, the man you were friends with for 25 years, is still in there somewhere. He made terrible choices, but he's not a monster. I spent that entire night thinking about Sarah's request. The next morning, I stood before Judge Harrison and delivered a victim impact statement that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including myself. Your Honor, David Chen tried to kill me, and I will never fully recover from that betrayal. But I also believe that desperate people sometimes make choices that don't reflect who they really are. David's cooperation with law enforcement has helped protect other potential victims, and while I can't forgive what he did, I can acknowledge that he's shown genuine remorse. I paused, looking directly at David. I asked the court to consider a sentence that reflects both the seriousness of his crimes and his efforts to make amends. Judge Harrison sentenced David to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. It was less than the maximum, but still ensured he'd spend most of his remaining productive years behind bars. As David was led away to begin serving his sentence, he mouthed thank you to me. I nodded in acknowledgement, though I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing. The legal consequences were just the beginning of David's punishment. The real penalty would be living with the knowledge that he'd destroyed a lifelong friendship for money he never got to spend. 6 months after David's sentencing, the federal case against the Kozlov organization went to trial. Viktor Petrov had been arrested in Miami while attempting to board a flight to Moscow, and several other members of the crime family had been apprehended in coordinated raids across 3 states. The trial was a media sensation, with prosecutors painting a picture of an international criminal conspiracy that had infiltrated American business communities for the purpose of money laundering, extortion, and murder. David's attempted poisoning of me was presented as just one example of the organization's willingness to kill for profit. As the prosecution's star witness, I spent 2 full days on the stand, describing my business relationship with Viktor, the Riverside Project, and how David had been recruited as an inside source. The defense tried to portray me as a naive businessman who'd been duped by both Viktor and David, but the evidence of the conspiracy was overwhelming. Viktor himself was a study in contrasts on the witness stand, dressed in an expensive suit and speaking with barely accented English. He looked more like a successful entrepreneur than an international criminal. But when prosecutor Amanda Chen, no relation to David, presented evidence of his real identity and criminal history, the facade crumbled. Mr. Kozlov, she said, using his real name, you invested $15 million in Mr. Sterling's Riverside project, didn't you? I invested $15 million. Yes, it was a legitimate business transaction. And where did that $15 million come from? Viktor's lawyer objected, but Judge Martinez allowed the question. Various business ventures in Eastern Europe, business ventures like heroin trafficking, human smuggling, and protection rackets. The objection was sustained, but the point had been made. Prosecutor Chen then presented bank records showing that Viktor's investment money had been filtered through 7 different shell companies in 4 countries, all linked to known money laundering operations. You weren't just making a real estate investment, were you, Mr. Kozlov? You were using Mr. Sterling's legitimate business to clean dirty money. I was making a legal investment in American real estate, and when that investment didn't generate enough clean money to satisfy your needs, you decided to steal the rest from Mr. Sterling directly. Viktor's lawyer objected again. But the damage was done. The prosecution had established that the Riverside project was both a money laundering operation and a setup for theft. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when David was brought from prison to testify against Victor. He looked pale and thin, clearly struggling with the weight of his imprisonment and the gravity of his testimony. Mr. Chen, Prosecutor Chen asked, how were you first approached by members of the Kozlov organization? They found me at the casino, David said quietly. They said they knew about my debts and could help me, but they needed information about Marcus in exchange. What kind of information? Everything. His daily routine, his security systems, his business relationships, his personal habits. They said they were considering him for a business partnership and needed to evaluate the risk. Did you believe that explanation? David paused for a long moment. At first, yes. But as the questions became more specific and more personal, I realized they weren't potential business partners. They were predators. And yet you continued to provide information about Mr. Sterling. Yes. By then I was in too deep to back out. They'd paid off some of my debts, and they threatened to expose my embezzlement if I didn't cooperate. The prosecution then presented recordings of phone conversations between David and Victor, captured by FBI surveillance after David began cooperating with the investigation. In one particularly damning conversation, Victor could be heard giving David detailed instructions about how to poison me and stage the scene afterward. Make it look natural, Victor's voice said through the courtroom speakers. Heart attack, stroke, something that won't trigger an autopsy. And make sure you're nowhere near him when it happens. What if he doesn't die right away? David's voice asked. Then you finish the job. We can't afford to have him survive and identify you. The coldness in Victor's voice was chilling. He was discussing my murder with the same tone he might use to plan a business meeting. Victor's defense team tried to argue that he was being framed by David, who was trying to reduce his own sentence by implicating others. But the physical evidence was too strong. The money trail, the recorded conversations, and the testimony of other victims who'd been targeted by the same organization. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Victor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Victor was led away in chains, he turned to look at me one final time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only calculation, as if he was still trying to figure out how his plan had gone wrong. This isn't over, he said loudly enough for me to hear. There are others who will finish what I started. Judge Martinez ordered him removed from the courtroom, but his threat hung in the air like smoke. Even from prison, Victor Kozlov was promising that the danger to my life wasn't finished. After the trial, Agent Foster briefed me on the ongoing investigation. We've disrupted this particular cell of the organization, she said. But Victor was right about one thing. There are others. The Kozlov crime family is large and well-connected, and they have a reputation for settling scores. Are you saying I'm still in danger? I'm saying you need to remain vigilant. We'll continue providing security, recommendations, and monitoring for threats, but you should assume that some members of this organization still consider you a target. As I left the courthouse that day, I realized that while justice had been served, my ordeal was far from over. David was in prison. Victor was facing life without parole, but the shadow of organized crime would hang over me for years to come. The price of survival was eternal vigilance. The months following Victor's conviction were among the darkest of my life. Despite having survived an assassination attempt and seen my attackers brought to justice, I found myself struggling with profound trust issues and a paranoia that affected every aspect of my daily routine. I'd moved from my house to a secure penthouse apartment, complete with bulletproof windows, electronic surveillance, and a private security team. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd survived an attempt on my life only to end up living like a prisoner in my own home. Sleep became elusive. Every unexpected sound triggered anxiety attacks that left me sweating and shaking. I found myself analyzing every interaction with business partners, employees, even casual acquaintances, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Morrison, helped me understand that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. What you experienced wasn't just an attempt on your life, she explained. It was a complete betrayal of trust by someone you considered family. That kind of trauma fundamentally changes how you see the world. The hardest part was accepting that my relationship with David might have been built on lies from the very beginning. Dr. Morrison encouraged me to examine our friendship objectively, to separate the genuine moments from the calculated manipulation. It's possible that David truly cared about you for most of your friendship, she said. People aren't usually entirely good or entirely evil. He may have been a real friend who made terrible choices when desperation overrode his moral compass. But even that perspective offered little comfort. If David could betray me after 25 years of friendship, how could I ever trust anyone again? My business relationships suffered as a result of my increased suspicion. I began requiring extensive background checks for new partners, installing security measures that bordered on paranoia, and maintaining emotional distance from people who'd been close associates for years. the legal aftermath was equally complicated. While Victor was in prison and David's assets had been seized to compensate his embezzlement victims, I still faced civil lawsuits from investors and projects that had been connected to Victor's money laundering operations. My lawyer, Robert, worked tirelessly to establish that I'd been an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant in Victor's schemes. The fact that he tried to have you killed actually helps our case, he explained. It proves you weren't a cooperative partner in his criminal activities. But the legal battles dragged on for months, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees and tying up several of my business ventures in litigation. Even being the victim of a crime had serious financial consequences. Perhaps most difficult was dealing with the reactions of friends and family. Some people were supportive and understanding, but others seemed to blame me for somehow attracting criminal attention. A few former friends distanced themselves entirely, apparently worried that associating with me might make them targets as well. Sarah Chen called me occasionally to check on my recovery, and these conversations were always emotionally complicated. She was struggling with her own trauma from discovering that her husband was a would-be murderer, while also dealing with the financial ruin David's crimes had brought to their family. I keep wondering if there were signs I missed, she told me during one call. David was my husband for 8 years. How could I not know what he was capable of? Because he didn't want you to know. He compartmentalized his life, kept his criminal activities separate from his marriage. That's not your failure, it's his deception. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really knew him at all. I understood that feeling completely. The David who'd been my best friend and the David who tried to poison me seemed like two entirely different people, but they'd somehow existed in the same body. 6 months after the trial, I made the decision to revise my will entirely. The document that had made David my heir was replaced with one that established a charitable foundation as my primary beneficiary. If someone killed me for my money now, at least they wouldn't be able to enjoy spending it. The new will also included provisions for substantial rewards for information leading to the arrest of anyone who harmed me, creating financial incentives for people to protect rather than attack me. It was a practical approach to personal security that acknowledged the harsh reality of my situation. I also increased my charitable giving while I was alive, reasoning that money I gave away couldn't be stolen from me. The Marcus Sterling Foundation began supporting causes related to crime victims, organized crime investigation, and addiction recovery programs. You're turning your trauma into something positive, Dr. Morrison observed. That's a healthy way to process what you've experienced. But even as I tried to build meaning from my suffering, the fundamental question remained: would I ever be able to trust anyone completely again? The answer, I was beginning to realize, was probably no. That David Chen, who'd been my best friend, was gone, replaced by the memory of a man who'd been willing to murder me for money. That loss felt almost as profound as death itself, because it forced me to question everything I thought I'd known about human nature and the reliability of love and friendship. Moving forward would require accepting that some betrayals leave permanent scars, and that sometimes survival means learning to live with those wounds rather than waiting for them to heal completely. 2 years after David's sentencing, I received a letter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about forgiveness and redemption. It arrived through my lawyer's office, having been screened by security personnel who'd become a permanent part of my life. The handwriting was David's, but his penmanship had changed during his time in prison. The letters were more careful, deliberate, as if he'd spent considerable time crafting each word. Dear Marcus, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it, but I needed you to know that I've spent every day of the past 2 years thinking about what I did to you, and I believe I finally understand the full scope of my betrayal. I almost did throw the letter away. Dr. Morrison and I had spent months working through my anger and hurt, and I wasn't sure I wanted to reopen those wounds, but something about the tone of David's writing made me continue reading. I'm not writing to ask for your forgiveness, because I know that's not something I can request or expect. I'm writing because I want you to understand that the person who poisoned you wasn't the real David Chen. It was someone I became when desperation and shame overcame everything good in me. The letter went on to describe David's experience in prison, his work with addiction counselors, and his participation in a victim impact program that had helped him understand the lasting trauma his actions had caused. I have been working with other inmates who committed crimes against people they loved, he wrote, domestic violence, fraud, even murder within families. What I've learned is that desperation can turn anyone into a monster, but that doesn't excuse the monster's actions or diminish the victim's pain. David described how he'd been using his accounting skills to help fellow inmates with financial literacy programs, teaching them how to manage money legally when they were eventually released. He'd also been working with law enforcement, providing information about other criminal organizations he'd encountered through Victor's network. I know this doesn't undo what I did to you, the letter continued, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to use the rest of my life to prevent other people from making the same choices I made. The most surprising part of the letter was David's description of a victims advocacy program he'd helped establish within the prison system. Inmates who'd committed crimes against friends or family members were required to participate in counseling sessions with other victims of similar crimes. Hearing from people who'd been betrayed the way I betrayed you was the most difficult thing I've ever done, David wrote. But it was also necessary. I needed to understand the full impact of my choices, not just on you, but on everyone who trusted me. At the end of the letter, David included information about a restitution fund he'd established. Using money from his prison job and donations from family members, the fund was designed to compensate victims of financial crimes, particularly those involving betrayal by trusted friends or family members. I can never repay you for what I took from you, not just the money I tried to steal, but your sense of safety and trust. But maybe I can help other victims recover what was stolen from them. I set the letter aside and didn't think about it for several days. When I finally discussed it with Dr. Morrison, she encouraged me to consider what David's apparent transformation might mean for my own healing process. Forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's actions, she explained. It's about releasing the hold that anger and resentment have on your own life. Whether David has truly changed or not, you can choose to let go of the hatred that's been eating away at you. A month later, I made an unexpected decision. I drove to the state penitentiary where David was serving his sentence and requested a visit. David looked older when he was brought to the visiting room. His hair now mostly gray and his face lined with what appeared to be genuine remorse. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Marcus, I can't believe you came." "I'm not sure I can believe it either," I admitted. But I needed to see for myself whether the person who wrote that letter was real or just another manipulation. David nodded, understanding. "I know you have no reason to trust anything I say, but I need you to know that every word in that letter was true. I've spent 2 years trying to understand how I became someone capable of what I did to you." We talked for an hour, and what struck me most was how different David seemed. The desperate, calculating man who'd tried to poison me was gone, replaced by someone who appeared genuinely broken by his actions and committed to making whatever amends were possible. "I don't expect your forgiveness," David said, as our visit ended. "I just hope that someday you'll be able to think about our friendship and remember some good times along with the betrayal." "I already do," I told him, surprising myself with the admission. "What you did was unforgivable, but that doesn't erase 23 years of genuine friendship." As I drove home from the prison, I realized that seeing David's apparent transformation had indeed helped my own healing process, not because I was ready to forgive him completely, but because I could finally separate the friend I'd loved from the criminal who'd tried to kill me. They were the same person, but they represented different choices and different values. The David I'd known for most of our friendship had been real, even if he'd ultimately made choices that betrayed everything our relationship had meant. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like I might eventually be able to trust someone again. 5 years have passed since David tried to poison me at what I thought was a celebration dinner. As I write this story, I'm sitting in my new office overlooking the city, surrounded by the fruits of a business empire that survived an assassination attempt and somehow grew stronger because of it. The Marcus Sterling Foundation has become one of the largest supporters of crime victim advocacy in the state. We've helped hundreds of people who suffered betrayal by trusted friends and family members, providing both financial assistance and counseling services. In a strange way, David's attempt on my life led to something that has genuinely improved other people's lives. Last month, I received news that David had been granted parole after serving 8 years of his 20-year sentence. His exemplary behavior in prison, combined with his work helping other inmates and victims, had convinced the parole board that he posed no further threat to society. I wasn't sure how I felt about his release until Sarah called me with an unexpected request. She wanted to meet with me before David was released, to discuss something she called closure. We met at a coffee shop downtown, the same place where we'd celebrated David's promotion to partner at his accounting firm 15 years earlier. Sarah looked older but more at peace than I'd seen her since David's arrest. "Marcus, I need to tell you something that might change how you think about David's crime," she began. "Something I discovered after he was already in prison." She pulled out a folder containing medical records and legal documents. 3 months before David poisoned you, I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. The treatment would have cost over $300,000. And our insurance would only cover 60% of it. I felt my stomach drop as I realized where this was going. David never told me about his gambling debts or his involvement with Victor's organization. But I think now that his desperation wasn't just about the money he owed, it was about the money he needed to save my life. Sarah's voice broke as she continued. "When I found out about the gambling and the embezzlement after his arrest, I assumed it was just greed and weakness. But the timeline matches up with my diagnosis. I think David was trying to steal enough money to pay for my cancer treatment." The revelation recontextualized everything I thought I understood about David's motivations. He hadn't just been trying to solve his gambling debts, he'd been trying to save his wife's life. "That doesn't excuse what he did," Sarah quickly added. "Trying to murder your best friend is unforgivable, regardless of the reason. But I thought you should know that his desperation had layers you might not have understood." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because David still doesn't know I found out about the cancer connection. He's been protecting me from that knowledge, even from prison, and because I wanted to ask you something. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense with emotion. When David gets out of prison, he's going to need help rebuilding his life. Not money, we both know he can never be trusted. With money again, but maybe a chance to prove that the man who was your friend for 25 years is still somewhere inside the man who betrayed you. I spent weeks thinking about Sarah's request and what it might mean to give David a second chance. Not as a friend, that relationship had been destroyed beyond repair, but as a human being trying to rebuild a life shattered by terrible choices. The answer came to me when I was reviewing applications for foundation grants. We'd received a proposal from a nonprofit that helped ex-convicts develop job skills and find employment after release. The program specifically focused on people who'd committed crimes against friends or family members and were struggling to rebuild relationships with their communities. I approved the grant and then made an additional decision. When David was released from prison, I would offer him a job with that nonprofit, helping other ex-convicts who'd betrayed people they loved. It wouldn't be forgiveness exactly, but it would be a chance for redemption. David was released on a Tuesday morning in September. I wasn't there to meet him, but Sarah was. Along with a social worker from the foundation-funded program, they drove him to a halfway house where he'd live for the next 6 months while transitioning back into society. 3 days later, David called me. His voice was hesitant, uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to contact me at all. Marcus, I heard about the job opportunity with the victims advocacy nonprofit. I wanted to thank you for making that possible. Don't thank me, I said. Earn it. Prove that the man I was friends with for 25 years is still in there. Somewhere I will. I promise you, I will. As I write the conclusion to this story, David has been working with ex-convicts for 6 months. According to the program director, he's been exceptionally effective at helping other people understand the impact of betrayal and the long road to rebuilding trust. I haven't seen David in person since that visit to the prison 3 years ago, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Some betrayals create permanent distance that can't be bridged, even with forgiveness and redemption. But I've learned that surviving betrayal isn't just about protecting yourself from future harm. It's about finding ways to transform the experience into something that helps other people avoid or overcome similar trauma. The friendship David and I shared for most of our adult lives is gone forever, destroyed by greed, desperation, and terrible choices. But something new has emerged from its ashes, a foundation that helps betrayal victims heal, a program that helps ex-convicts rebuild their lives, and an understanding that even the worst human actions can sometimes lead to meaningful change. If you've made it this far in my story, you've probably experienced betrayal yourself, or you know someone who has. What I want you to understand is that survival is possible, healing is possible, and sometimes even redemption is possible, though not always in the ways we expect. Trust, once broken, may never be fully restored. But that doesn't mean we stop living, stop building relationships, or stop believing in the possibility that people can choose to be better than their worst moments. David Chen tried to murder me for money, and that fact will never change. But he also spent 25 years as my loyal friend, and that fact won't change either. Both things can be true simultaneously, and learning to live with that complexity has been the most difficult and most important lesson of my life. If you're dealing with betrayal by someone you trusted, know that you're not alone. There are people who understand your pain, programs that can help you heal, and foundations like mine that exist specifically to support you through the darkest parts of your journey. And if you're someone who has betrayed a friend or family member, know that redemption is possible, not through asking for forgiveness, but through dedicating the rest of your life to ensuring that other people don't experience the same pain you caused. The choice, as always, is yours.